Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief at The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our program, The Economic Snapshot, a CEO summit checking the pulse of the U.S. economy today. The post-pandemic economy has defied expectations repeatedly. The U.S. labor market and consumer spending are chugging along while inflation is cooling, yet risks of a recession and a debt ceiling showdown loom. As the Federal Reserve takes steps to slow inflation, what can consumers expect to see over the next year? Is the threat of a recession real? And what are the biggest risks facing the economy? We have an all-star lineup today, but before we get underway, just a reminder that you can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillCEO. Our first guest is Rodney McMullen, Chairman and CEO of Kroger McMullen. McMullen began his career in 1978 as a part-time stock clerk. So he's been there quite a long time and has risen to chairman of the board and CEO of the Kroger Company. Welcome, Rodney.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate the invite.
Well, as I mentioned, just remarkable that you've been there since 1978. Just start about how the industry has changed. I know that's a big, broad question to start with, but also, and then at the end of it, kind of a two-parter, the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic now that it's over.
Yeah, one of the things, I always love the question because one of the things that when I'm recruiting somebody to our industry and our company, I always like to highlight how the company changes and how the way people eat change. And I always tell people, the only thing I know for sure is people will keep eating and the way they eat will continually change. And if you look at when I entered the business, people usually would shop once a week for all their groceries for the week. And there was a very limited number of places for somebody to go get that. If you look at today, half of food money is spent at restaurants and half of the money spent at restaurants, people either eat it in their car or take it home and eat it. So when you think about changes, the ability to find food, even the auto parts companies sell food. So, it's always changing, but that's one of the things that makes it so much fun. If you look at COVID, and I'm sure, Bob, you'll ask a couple more questions. One of the things that COVID did was greatly accelerate what we would call seamless. And we call seamless where somebody can get a delivery, pick up in store, or actually shop in one of our stores. And what we find is people bounce back and forth between those. Literally, there was 3 years worth of growth in 3 weeks. If you look at since post-COVID, It's stayed at that elevated level, and now it's continuing to grow again on a trend line similar to pre-COVID. The other thing that COVID has allowed is a lot of people learned how to cook. And with the economic situation for many customers, that knowing how to cook is a huge benefit.
That's interesting. I am not in that crew. I can barely make toast. But I just wanted to ask you about the trends. Do you think going forward, you mentioned, some people, they've obviously, the pandemic changed, number one, the future of work, the future of shopping. But as far as specifically, you mentioned some people still, they're ordering and then they're picking it up as opposed to going into the store now. Do you think that's changing? I mean, you're seeing obviously fewer masks and people wanting to get out there. Or do you think that shopping for groceries has changed forever?
I think shopping for groceries has changed forever. And some of it is just convenience. So if you think about, some people will want to have a delivery order because they can do it before they get the kids off to school or go to work. Other people might want to pick up because they're taking their kids to soccer practice or something. The thing that we find is people, when they shop with us online, either pickup or delivery, they still like to physically go into a store, but they only go into a store when they want to, as opposed to when they feel like they have to. And everything we can see, I think it's permanently changed because, it's all about, not having to compromise, being able to have incredibly fresh food, but the way you want to buy it, the way you want to get it.
Sure. I do have an audience question for you that I'd like to ask you, and it comes from Greg Lane, founder, Next Generation Strategies Public Affairs Group. And Greg asks, food prices continue to soar. Do you see them returning to pre-pandemic levels on their own? If not, what steps, like new technologies improving efficiencies, could Kroger take to help reduce them? What's your answer to that one?
Yeah, I love the question. If you look at food pricing, we do expect it to continue being the increase to be lower in the later part of the year than it is today. If you look at commodity items, you will see some commodity items where pricing actually decreases. So if you think about eggs are cheaper today than they were 6 months ago. We would expect egg prices to continue to decrease. So if you look at commodity items, you definitely are seeing things starting to come down in price. If you look at things that are more just the cost of doing business in terms of, our average hourly rate is up about 30% over the last 5 years. If you look at our average pay now is over $18 an hour. If you add benefits to that, it's over $23 an hour. If you look at our suppliers, they would have similar type of cost increases across. Those are things where as we're higher inflation, we would not expect that to go back to the way it was before. So it's a fine balance. You're always looking at technology in terms of how do you improve processes. The area that we would be using AI and the things around AI and machine learning the most would be like on our supply chain. And how do you make sure that you take days out of the supply chain so you can get produce to the customer, 2 or 3 days earlier? How do you make sure that everything you're selling is fresh? Things like that. So technology is as much driven in terms of supporting freshness and how to making sure customers have fresher product as in some cases, improving to take costs out. So, that is how we've been able to invest in our average hourly rate is through some of the process changes over the last several years.
Rodney, as far as AI, and that's obviously a lot of industry leaders taking a look at it, people trying to make sense of it, really absorbing as much information, what it means for the future. When you say using AI, are you talking longer term, or how 1 year, 2 year, 5 years that this technology is going to improve efficiencies?
Yeah, we're actually using it today in test examples. So if you look at what's called a 2D code, we're able to make sure that something that we sell to the customer has at least 5 days of freshness left on it when they buy it. Now, we haven't scaled those types of things, but we actually are testing it in stores. So it's really focused on for us, we think AI will be a huge benefit in terms of improving the customer experience, personalizing every offer exactly for that particular family, and understanding what flavors they like and other things. So you just make it feel like a shopping experience one to one. So for us, it's more about how do we help our associates be able to do their job easier, and how do we make the customer's experience be more positive, more fun.
You mentioned higher wages and the nation's unemployment rate very low. That's great news in some respects. My kids are going to be heading out to the workforce over the next 5 to 7 years, and that's a good sign. However, whether it's journalism or banking, I imagine your industry, it's harder to find talent. How are you dealing with those workforce challenges?
Yeah, for us, one of the things that at Kroger, what we find is we always talk about come for a job and discover a career. And if we have somebody that stays with us for a year, they make a career out of Kroger, and they find they really enjoy working around people, having something that's fun to do, challenging, something that hasn't been done before, and taking care of customers. So for us, everything we do, we're trying to make sure that somebody comes for a job, but then we have all kinds of things for them to discover a career. We have what we call Feed Your Future, and last year over 5,000 people took advantage of our Feed Our Future, and I always like to talk about we'll support somebody from their GED to their PhD. And all of those things, what we're doing is things to support people to where they discover one of the great things about Kroger, and you also help them grow so they can take on more responsibility. And when both of those things happen, it creates where somebody really enjoys working here. Obviously, their pay improves over time. So, when I look at, I think low unemployment is a fabulous thing. When I got out of college, I know unemployment was very high, and a lot of the people I went to college with couldn't find jobs doing things that they went to college on. So, when I look at it, I think it's an incredibly good thing, but it does make your day job a little more complicated, but that's okay.
Sure. How do you gauge consumer feedback, whether that's on your company or their concerns going forward? What are you hearing from customers?
Yeah, we talk to our customers every single week, and we get feedback every week. If you look at what they're telling us today, you have some customers that are incredibly uncomfortable. They're tight on a budget. Inflation has put their budgets under a lot of pressure, and they're trying to feed their family. And that customer is telling us they're doing a lot of behavior changes. Some of those behavior changes are pushing out big purchases. Others are eating at home more because you can eat at home for a fourth, a third the cost of going out to a restaurant. They're moving to our brands. They take advantage of our discounts. We personalize discounts for each household, and we see a higher usage of paper coupons or electronic coupon usage. So a ton of behavior changes with that customer, really helping them stretch their budget. If you look at customers that are, we would call them customers that aren't, less price sensitive. Mm-hmm. That customer continues to behave just like during COVID and pre-COVID, where you see them continuing to buy wine that they want, continuing to engage in Starbucks, things like that. So we're probably seeing more difference among customers than we've seen in a long time. And then if you look at customers on a budget, the changes in the SNAP program, which is the new name for food stamps, that's definitely affecting that customer in terms of being able to put food on their table.
Just general viewpoints. I know you talked a little bit before about inflation. I mean, do you think we're on the right track? Are you optimistic? Most of the country is not optimistic about the economy. Certainly, well more than half think we're either going into recession or are in a recession right now. What are you seeing in the data?
Well, I definitely think if you look at over the next 6 to 12 months, customers and behavior, people are feeling the pressure of higher interest rates and inflation across most parts of what they would buy, cars, utility costs, everything. I'm always an optimist. So if you go out 5 or 10 years, I always think America will turn out great. It's just not very smooth always getting there. And I'm incredibly optimistic long term. But if you look at over the next 6 to 12 months, I definitely think customers continue to feel the pressure on their own household.
You mentioned at the top of the interview that people have to eat, but what they eat has changed over the years and decades that you've been with the company. Are we eating healthier? Obviously, obesity is a major concern in this country.
Yeah, it's. I love the question. Yeah, if you look, natural organics, people are definitely eating better from that regard. If you look at snacking, people snack more than they used to. Some people snack in place of a meal, but others snack in between a meal. And, the thing that I'm optimistic about is I think technology will allow people to figure out things they like eating that's healthier for them and easier. Over time, I think that's good. But, I'm like you, I worry about obesity a lot. If you look at medical costs in the U.S., about half of medical costs would be affected if people ate differently. If you look at people that live in neighborhoods that are low in terms of fresh food offerings and things like that, you would see a higher rate of diabetes, for an example. So it's a huge concern. It's something that is incredibly important to us, and we're partnering with the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Heart Association, to try to be a partner in doing our part to help people eat healthier.
That's certainly a great cause. Rodney, we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us. Rodney McMullen, Chairman and CEO of Kroger. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Bob.
The retail industry impacts everyone, everywhere, every day. My next guest is Matthew Shea, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Retail Federation. Retail is the nation's largest private sector employer and supports 1 in 4 U.S. jobs. Welcome, Matthew.
Hey, Bob. Thanks. Nice to be here.
Well, we're in Washington. We have a debt limit showdown. People are trying to read the tea leaves on the economy going forward, not only for the rest of this year, but going into next year. Obviously, big presidential election. The economy is going to be on the ballot. What do you see going forward coming out of the pandemic? Where are we in the U.S. economy?
Well, I think, Bob, the answer is depending on where you are in terms of your household income and the way in which you work and live in the neighborhood and region in which you live. We're seeing Americans with different kinds of experiences. Certainly heard Rodney allude to that. Rodney sees millions and millions of consumers every day, every week, and throughout the year. So Rodney can speak to that, and I think did very well. There are certainly consumers in some parts of the country and in certain household income levels that are under an enormous amount of stress. More of their monthly disposable income is being devoted to food, energy, transportation costs, housing, commodities, and less of it's being devoted to discretionary spending. In some cases, less of it's being devoted to experiential and services spending. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Certainly things have changed pretty dramatically from the go-go days of 2021, even the late part of 2020 and almost all of 2021, when inflation really started to take a bite out of the consumer economy, was in the spring and summer of 21 and really started to show up. So I think we're in a period of great uncertainty. There's a lot we don't know. And yet, in spite of that, consumers keep spending. So I think that's what makes it so confusing to try to discern what's really happening.
On inflation, do you think we are heading in the right direction? There's a lot of speculation. Obviously, the Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, has been increasing rates but it does seem like it's coming to an end at some point. Obviously, Wall Street watching that very closely, but that affects everybody. What's your take on that?
Well, certainly it hurts all of us as consumers without even beginning to talk about the implications for the financial system and investments and capital markets and all the other things that are impacted by increasing cost of debt and the debt ceiling. But, I think we're going to continue to have to fight the inflation fight. I think there's certainly agreement among the people that I talk to that allowing inflation to become embedded in the economy would be devastating. And we know that inflation hurts lower income families more than higher income families because it impacts their share of wallet that they can devote to things other than the necessities and the commodities they have to pay for every month. So I think fighting the inflation fight needs to continue to be job number one. Depending upon what measure you use, CPI, PCE, you unpack some of those measures and look at individual categories of goods. We're seeing some disinflation in certain parts of the retail economy. Rodney referenced some moderation in some food prices. We've seen energy prices up and down again. So I think there's still a lot of an unknown factor in what's going on inside inflation. You hear the Federal Reserve governors, voting and non-voting members having that debate a little more openly now about what's the right course. So at some point, the Fed will have done enough. I'm not sure that we're there yet. I think we need some more data to really be certain that we're squeezing inflation out of the economy.
I mentioned the debt limit. We do have a question for you, for each of the speakers today. And this comes from Selwyn Whitehead, attorney and counselor at law offices of Selwyn D. Whitehead. And he asked, how will you deal with the expected slowdown in consumer spending and possible recession if Congress fails to increase the debt limit? I do want to note that the debt limit vote is scheduled in the House tonight. It is expected to pass the House, but you never know. Then it's got to go to the Senate, and we got a deadline on Monday. So what's your answer to that reader question?
Well, Bob, like you, I feel pretty confident at this point from the conversations we're having and the discussions we've had with congressional leadership and others that we're going to get the debt ceiling increased so we can maintain the full faith and credit of the United States and fulfill our financial commitments. So I think we feel good about that. In terms of what happens next, I guess I would sort of paraphrase Rodney's observation that he knows people are going to continue to eat. He just doesn't know exactly what they're going to eat and the way they're going to eat. I would say we can expect that consumers are going to continue to consume and to shop and to be engaged in commerce, but it's going to change and evolve. And as it always has, we've seen dramatic shifts in the last decade with regard to the way in which we use e-commerce and mobile devices to engage in commerce. We saw dramatic shifts in behavior throughout, during, and the recovery from the pandemic. I know we're going to continue to see changes, but we've seen consecutive month-over-month, year-over-year increases in retail spending for more than 30 consecutive months now. So consumers are powering the economy. Retailers are working with consumers and their associates and their partners to find ways to meet the changing behaviors of consumers and the challenges in the economy. So I think we feel confident, and we're forecasting this year 4 to 6% growth over last year's retail sales growth, which was 7%. The year before that, it was 14%. So we've had serious growth the last few years. In 3 years, we've had the kind of growth you'd normally see in a decade. So consumers have been engaged. At some point, we think we're going to revert back to more traditional 3 to 4% growth. But even that is pretty impressive relative to other markets around the world. So I think we'll see consumers keep shopping and staying engaged, but the way in which they do that's going to change.
As far as retail, Rodney mentioned that as far as grocery stores, shopping has changed forever. Obviously, shopping changed dramatically during the pandemic. How has that affected you? And the second part of the question, when you say consumers are powering the economy, from your perspective, are you seeing that in certain parts of the country, or is it pretty consistent throughout?
Well, I'd say, Bob, the way in which we've seen changes and behaviors that were evolved or accelerated during the pandemic. I think that would go to issues like payments, issues like fulfillment, supply chain behavior, a whole series of technology implementations, the use of mobile phones to make payment, for example, and how widely that was adopted during the pandemic. Buy online, pick up in store, home delivery, same day delivery, next day delivery. Lots of trends that were already taking place in the economy that really got accelerated. So I think we're going to continue to see that. I'm not sure how many new behaviors we really saw emerge during the pandemic. There were lots of these trends already underlying in retail behavior and consumer engagement, but it really got accelerated over the past 3 years.
What about AI? What do you see that changing? Obviously, you're big into customer service. There's some excitement about AI. There's some concern about AI. How will it affect your industry?
Yeah, I was at a CEO event a few weeks ago, sponsored and hosted by Microsoft, and Satya Nadella and Bill Gates, and there were probably 75 CEOs in attendance. And Sam Altman was one of the speakers, and I thought he had a really interesting insight. He said that in the near term, he thinks AI is overhyped, but in the long term, he thinks AI is underhyped. And I think you sort of unpack that a little bit, that we're not going to see massive disruption to our economy necessarily from AI in the next 12 months, but in the next decade or the next 2 decades, we'll see AI deployed as we've seen previous waves of technology deployed, and there'll be all kinds of processes that will change. There'll be implications for jobs and careers, which will then free humans up to pursue other kinds of jobs and careers. I think there are enormous potential upsides for retailers in terms of delivering customized, personalized experience and increasing the efficiency of customer engagement, improving supply chain efficiencies, and improving sustainability successes. Certainly, there's potential for mischief with this technology. We've seen examples of that already. So what we're hearing, I think, from all of these AI pioneers and thought leaders is a plea for congressional leaders and other elected leaders to get in front of this and set some rules of the road. But as you know, Bob, and we've seen frequently, our lawmakers are behind the marketplace. So I think it's really incumbent upon all of us that are going to be impacted as citizens and as stakeholders to encourage congressional leaders to enact an appropriate roadmap to make sure that we get the most of the promise of AI without getting sort of the worst of the peril.
And Matthew, that kind of tees up my next question about, obviously, retailers, like so many others, have to be watching what regulatory agencies are doing, what Congress is doing on a number of fronts, whether that's healthcare or trade or labor issues. What are you watching very closely, and what would you like to see D.C. policymakers do more of or do less of?
Well, I think in terms of issues that are specific to retail, we've talked about more generally what's happening with the economy, behaving responsibly on getting the debt limit increased and doing the sorts of things that keep our economy moving forward. But specific to retail, the number one issue that we're hearing from our members about in the current environment is organized retail crime and theft and shrinkage, and what's taking place in many markets around the country in terms of the health and safety of consumers, of employees, of local communities. We've done a study recently published that estimates $95 billion a year is lost to theft, organized retail crime, shrinkage, and that's having a real impact. It's creating unsafe environments for store associates, for team members, for consumers, for local communities, and it's the result of many years of a variety of factors coming together in the current environment and contributing to a climate in which we're seeing really brazen, visible examples of these organized thieves come into stores in particular, but it occurs throughout the supply chain and distribution chain, whether it's along the railroad spurs, or whether it's in local deliveries, whether it's in distribution centers, whether it's in the ports. And it's creating a real economic issue, but it's also creating an unsafe environment. And so I think at the moment, our request is that congressional leaders come together, pass the Organized Retail Crime Act, get some resources directed to the Department of Homeland Security to coordinate and aggregate across federal, state, local law enforcement agencies, and to really begin to tackle the roots of this problem. And Bob, I guess I'd just end by saying, if this were a retail problem, retailers would have solved it by now. This is an issue that's manifesting itself at the retail level, but it's a problem that impacts all of us in the communities in which we live, and we all need to be part of that solution.
Are you confident that that legislation can get through in this session of Congress? Maybe it's added to a moving vehicle.
Well, we've got a great bipartisan bill that's moving through the House and Senate. We've got companion bills. We're adding co-sponsors every day. So I think congressional leaders are increasingly aware of this as a problem. They're hearing about it from their constituents. They see it in their own communities. It's really very visible and inescapable to all of us. When you consume local and national news media, you see what's happening. So I think we're generating an enormous amount of awareness about this issue. We've put forward a really responsible solution, working with the bipartisan sponsors and co-sponsors of the legislation. So we're confident we're going to continue to gain momentum, and we're certainly hopeful that we're going to find a vehicle that's going to serve as an opportunity for passage of this and signing into law.
Last question. What's the most rewarding part of your job?
Well, I think representing an industry that creates so many opportunities for so many individuals. We're the largest private sector employer in the United States. We create jobs for more than 1 in 4 Americans, generate 20% of the nation's GDP. You heard some of that from Rodney, but that's true across all the categories we represent, from the very largest retailer in the United States and around the world to the very smallest single unit store on a local main street in small town Ohio, where I grew up. So that diversity, the opportunity, the career possibilities, the impact on communities, it's all part of the retail industry. We think it's a great mosaic and an ecosystem that creates a lot of pathways for people. And even if you don't stay in the job forever, as Rodney has done, or some of the rest of us have done, the retail industry is a great first job for millions of Americans. And we hope it continues that way for as long as we possibly can see that.
Matthew Shea, President and CEO of the National Retail Federation. Thanks for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks, Bob. My pleasure.
Now it's time to check in with the chief executive of the online e-commerce giant eBay. Welcome, Jamie Iannone, to the program. Jamie, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Bob. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Okay, well, I was reading up on eBay, and wow, you really thrived during the pandemic. Obviously, it was a tough time, challenging time, but also you help power the economy. Can you just kind of talk about going into the pandemic? I remember talking to a key lawmaker who was briefed by intelligence officials and said this will probably last a couple weeks. Well, it lasted a couple years, and that was very unexpected. But kind of your thoughts and reflections on lessons learned and going forward.
Yeah, one of the great things about the eBay model is the vast diversity of our seller base. So think, from the smallest, independent seller to small businesses running on the platform. And during the pandemic, I'm really, really proud of how our sellers stepped up during that time period, really making sure that they could be there to provide goods to Americans, frankly, to individuals all around the world during what was extremely challenging times. And so we didn't really have the issues of a choked supply chain or anything like that because of the broad seller base that we have. And what we saw is that people started needing things, first medical equipment that they needed for their homes or for their places of business, to things that they needed when they stayed at home, from laptop equipment and desk equipment to fitness equipment. And then really eBay, people were just taking advantage of their hobbies during that time. So we saw strength in our parts and accessories business as people were fixing up their cars and doing other things during those challenging times. One of the things I'm really proud of is we actually helped distribute PPE during that time. So we used our technology to distribute 6 billion PPE items to people that needed it. So really proud of how our employees here and how our seller community stepped up to get people the things they needed during what was very challenging times.
You recently announced a new Certified by Brand initiative. Can you tell us about that program and why you launched it?
Yeah, this has been an important part of what we've been doing is working directly with brands so that they can come onto the platform and sell directly. As you look at it, whether that's new items, used items, refurbished items, brands are looking for ways to have access to consumers, looking to have a solution for sustainability and re-commerce. And eBay is the perfect vehicle for them. So as part of the Certified by Brand, they're labeled as such. We stand behind everything that they're doing with eBay Money Back Guarantee. And think of this, Bob, more as a theme of what we're doing, which is really changing the level of trust on the platform. When I got back as CEO 3 years ago, we really started investing in things like authentication. So we now authenticate sneakers, handbag, watches, trading cards, really making sure that the buyer is getting the item that they expected to get. It stops at an eBay facility. And we've really been raising the level of trust on the platform, which has been fantastic. On our refurbished items, we launched a program called eBay Refurbished, which guarantees a warranty on that product, usually a 2-year warranty, 30-day hassle-free returns, and eBay Money Back Guarantee. So think of eBay now as getting values across the spectrum with this higher level of trust and returning back great values to customers.
Jamie, I know you're on TV a lot talking about the economy, and it's interesting talking to lawmakers and talking to business leaders like yourself and trying to gauge where we're going. At the beginning of the pandemic, polls show really an enormous amount of optimism about the economy. But then as it dragged on, those numbers change. What are you seeing? Some are skeptical, some are bullish. What do you see out of the economy in the next 18 months?
Yeah, look, we're certainly in uncertain times and dynamic times right now. Consumer confidence, discretionary income are being impacted by all the things that we've been talking about, right? The geopolitical uncertainty, inflation, rising interest rates, et cetera. So, as we talked about in our last earnings call, we think some of these headwinds will persist throughout the year from that perspective. And what we're doing is controlling what we can control. Because, frankly, challenging times can be a benefit for the eBay platform and for our sellers. So some of our best small businesses on the platform are actually created during tough economic times. I was talking to a seller who during COVID lost his job with the Orlando Magic and turned his time into creating a business on eBay. Back in other challenging times like 08 or 09, tons of stories of people using these times to just start selling on eBay as a way of needing income and then turning that into a small business. I like to call that accidental entrepreneurs that we've created on this platform during these tough times. At the same side, on the buying side, people can find a refurbished item where they might have bought a new item where they need a value because their dollar's a little bit more stretched. So that's what we're seeing on the platform, and that's how we've kind of planned the balance of the year.
And that leads to an audience question, which is related to what you were saying about small business. This is from Bruce Lundegren. He's Assistant Chief Counsel, the U.S. Small Business Administration. Do you see a difference in how large versus small businesses are performing in the current economic climate? You mentioned small business. Do you see a disparity?
Yeah, what we see for small businesses is that they find ways to be resilient on the platform. And in fact, how critical eBay is for those small businesses. So we just did a small business survey, which we released earlier this month. And what we found is that, 71% of people said eBay actually helped them start their business, create a small business. And a third of them said their small business wouldn't exist without what eBay has provided for them on the platform. So it shows that eBay really is the face of small business. And one of the things I like to say is, eBay's principle and our mission is about creating economic opportunity for all, so that a small and individual seller can sell right alongside a large seller. And so we look at as our platform is really, raising all boats with small and large sellers. It's why one of the things we're focused on is the 1099K issue of really getting that limit raised. It was lowered to $600 during the American Rescue Plan. And raising that limit back up to a more healthy level will make sure that we can create a lot more accidental entrepreneurs in the future. For the most part, these people aren't making a profit. When you're talking about $600, that's selling, your bikes out of the garage. And, you may not have the receipt from that. That was 20 years ago. We want to keep that flywheel of re-commerce working because eBay is the pioneer of re-commerce. And we definitely don't want that friction to mean those products are going to end up in the landfill rather than the hands of a second or third happy buyer for re-commerce. So really think of the work that we're doing as really trying to promote that small business and their success of growing on the platform.
I do want to follow up on that because there has been a lot of confusion, as you know, on the $600 threshold and the IRS action on it. And there was a lot of confusion, certainly during the height of tax season. You mentioned raising that. What do you think that level should be? What would be fair? Is it anywhere near $600?
Well, there's a bunch of bipartisan support now. In fact, there was a bill recently introduced that would raise that level to $10,000 and I believe 50 transactions. And that would actually eliminate about 85% of the incremental millions of tax forms that just eBay would be selling and overloading the IRS with if we even got to that level. So we would be supportive of doing that. And we think, that's that level is kind of appropriate where you start getting into like the really business size that may be making a profit. Before then, there really isn't a whole lot of income and it's just a lot of paperwork. And unfortunately, I think it'll be more products in the landfill rather than driving for re-commerce. So we're really hoping, I see support on both sides to move that forward. And I'm really hoping that can get done this year.
And that is rare that you see both sides or bipartisanship in Washington. The debt limit has to be bipartisan in divided government, but rarely is anything. So you do think that perhaps even this year that could maybe get passed to an appropriations bill that's moving through Congress, or if it doesn't move this year, that because of its bipartisan support, it would move sometime in 2024?
Yeah, look, we're really hoping that it moves this year because otherwise people are going to start getting tax forms at the beginning of next year. So it's really critical. I think, there was a 1-year delay put in place last year because I think both sides on a bipartisan realized that 600 is way too low of a threshold and that this would really kind of impact that entrepreneurship, that small business, and frankly, overload the IRS. So with that support, we really need to get it passed this year with some kind of vehicle, because otherwise those tax forms will have to start going out the beginning of next year. And I think it's really confusing for an individual who sold, $800 of old bike stuff or old stuff out of the garage to get a 1099K and try and figure out what to do with that. It's extremely challenging. And in most cases, they're not going to have a receipt for something they bought 10 or 15 years ago. So really critical that we get something passed with support, with bipartisan support this year.
There are a number of companies that have let employees go. eBay recently let 500 employees go. What's the status of the workforce? And as far as eBay going forward, we both have a kind of a labor problem now, but we also have an aging population that's going to cause real problems 10, 20 years from now.
Yeah, look, one of the great things about eBay's platform is that we create economic opportunity for other people. So it was unfortunate what we went through with layoffs, but overall we'll end up actually with more people than fewer at the start of the year with the hiring that we're doing in key areas of the company. So we're definitely in a business that's focused on cost, but also focused on growing. But more importantly is what we enable. We have 17 million sellers on the platform was the last public number we talked about, and 133 million buyers. And so looking at the opportunities, how do we unlock more of that potential in challenging times? Like I talked about, there are people that, were let go of their jobs, or they need more flexibility because they've got to care for children at home and need flexibility in how they work. I recently was talking to someone who had lost a lot of their funding because they had to pay for the health care of their child, and now they needed a way to make income. And so one of the great things about eBay is that people turn to this platform as a way to make income. And then a lot of them actually turn that into a small business on eBay and end up hiring other people. We've created 1 million jobs on the platform through what the platform does. So not just what we do as a company, but what this platform does to create opportunities for Americans is truly fantastic.
What is eBay doing with AI?
Yeah, we're really excited by the advancements in AI. We've been using AI for many, many years. You can't run a platform like we run. We have 1.8 billion live listings, like I talked about, 133 million buyers, without using AI to help people find things that they need on the platform, to help create better experiences and recommendations and things like that. But one of the things I'm excited to talk about is that we actually have a test out there in beta right now that our sellers are using, where we'll actually write the description for them. So say, for example, I found an old garage door opener for a garage door opener, remote, sorry, for a garage door opener I no longer have. I didn't really know what it was, but eBay was able to figure out what it was, write the whole description, and I sold that product for $25 to someone who needed that garage door remote. Now, that product would have ended up in the landfill without really using tools like AI to create this amazing, magical experience on eBay, where this thing just automatically writes the description of that garage door remote. And so what I'm excited by is what AI is going to do to unlock for our sellers the ability to bring more of that inventory onto the platform. You know, the average household, Bob, has $4,000 worth of items that they can sell on eBay, and less than 20% of that is currently online. So the ability to use new AI technologies to make that even easier on the platform gets me excited for what we'll do for e-commerce, what we'll do for creating even more small businesses in the next decade.
You must have a lot of anecdotes, but I want you to pick the best one, because I imagine when you go around meeting people around the country and you tell them your position at eBay, you get some feedback. Can you describe what that's like?
Yeah, you know what? I love feedback. I hear great stories. My dentist told me, he's in there with my teeth and fixing me up, and he's like, during COVID, Jamie, I had less dental appointments, so I started fixing up my car with your parts and accessories business. And he's like, now you keep recommending more parts. I've now bought like 12 different parts because he's restoring this old vehicle. And he's like, I love what you're doing in parts and accessories. And parts and accessories is an example of a category that we're investing in. It's a key focus category for us. We're growing at market rates of growth now, and we're able to have buyers like him really fuel their passion through what we're doing. But I also love critical feedback. The best ideas of things that we do on the platform come from our community, either our community of sellers or buyers. Last year, our sellers told us we needed to improve the number of pictures that we have on the platform, because people buying handbags want to see every stitch, every corner, and see exactly what's in there. And so we made it easier to put up 24 pictures for free, and then we added videos to the platform. So now you can take a video of those products, and we're working on new 360 technology. So that feedback is so critical, and I love being out there in sellers' place of business, hearing their thoughts, and then bringing them new innovations to help them grow on eBay.
Jamie Iannone, CEO of eBay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Bob, for having me on.
The restaurant industry was one of the areas hardest hit by the pandemic. How is the industry recovering? We are now joined by Michelle Korsmo, President and CEO of the National Restaurant Association. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing well. So let's start out with that. Everyone knows that it was very difficult on the restaurant industry. I think everyone knows somebody who probably lost a restaurant job at one point or the other. But now, and I was traveling like so many people were over the Memorial Day weekend, and the restaurants are bustling. What's going on?
Well, it's exactly that. Restaurants are bustling. And when you were talking about the restaurant people that have lost jobs, it's also the people that may have lost one of their favorite neighborhood restaurants that didn't make it through the pandemic. That makes all of us a little bit sad because we miss those parts of our communities. But right now, restaurants are coming back and people feel great. In fact, 4 out of 5 restaurant operators expect to be fully backed by the end of this year. And that's a great thing. 74% of them are reporting higher sales than last year, which is exactly what we want to see. And restaurants are on track to contribute $1 trillion to the economy. So just a really terrific position for the restaurant industry to be poised for growth at a time when they really want it.
And what patterns have you seen, Michelle, regarding it during the worst parts of the pandemic. People were getting takeout. It couldn't even go into restaurants, a lot of restaurants anyway. What are the patterns now? Because obviously some people still have major health considerations. I know people still getting COVID. Are you seeing kind of any patterns of takeout and eat in that our audience would like to know?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what we call off-premise food. So people that are taking restaurant food away from the dining room. And that number continues to be very high. In fact, 2/3 of all restaurant meals are consumed outside of a restaurant dining room. Now, that includes all of the drive-through business that you'll notice from any quick service restaurant. But more than that, we're finding that consumers have actually changed the way they eat since we kind of changed the way we had to eat at restaurants during the pandemic. And I like to think of it as restaurant meals beyond just the dining room or the drive-through. They're thinking about taking out restaurant meals and serving at home as a restaurant or as a meal for their family. We're seeing a lot of people that are thinking more about, are they picking up? Are they delivering? Different ways that they can access that restaurant food. And the other thing we're finding is that because we still are in a different work environment where we're not 100% back in the office the way we used to, or downtown areas or neighborhoods have shifted a bit, we're also seeing that what we would consider traditional meal patterns have changed, and people aren't getting breakfast food just at breakfast time or lunch just in that kind of lunch hour, but they're actually looking for meals at various times of the day. We see a nice pickup in the middle of the day for snacks, a nice late night business. So restaurant food is different than the traditional expectation.
And that leads to an audience question. This for you, Michelle. This is from Christiane Riki, chef/owner of the restaurant E. Riki. And what does the future look like for restaurants serving the in-city business community? Will workers be returning to their urban offices? I know you just mentioned that, our office, more and more people are coming in, but, no one's here 5 days a week. I imagine there's a little bit of a difference between, there's a lot of foot traffic in cities as opposed to rural areas.
There is, and we're seeing that difference in what's happening for restaurants. So if you're in an urban area like Iriki is in a beautiful downtown Washington, D.C., that pattern has changed where they may not have as many late nights. It may be very much in the middle of the week because that's a busier time for people in the office. But the other thing that's happening is a lot of downtowns are changing the way they're offering environments. Just down the street from Iriki, there's an office building that's being converted into a residential building to come online in another year. And so with more residential space taking up some of the space that traditional commercial real estate has taken, I think you're going to find that restaurants will find new and different meal patterns and different customers. But it will take time. And for those restaurants that are in urban areas, they are having a much different time kind of coming back to what they would consider full service restaurant status. And it's tough. And so people should think about that as well when they're thinking about their favorite restaurants, because they are, again, more dependent upon that takeout and delivery meal that you just talked about.
Speaking of tough things and challenges, as we were coming out and getting toward the end of the pandemic, now that we can look at it in the rearview mirror, inflation has soared. What has been the impact of inflation passing along some of the cost to consumers, because the restaurant can't take it all after, barely surviving, at least some of them, many of them, during the pandemic?
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing that's happening when you look at restaurants. It's hard to tell on the outside what's actually happening from the financial health of that restaurant, because there were almost 200,000 restaurants that didn't receive funding through the Restaurant Revitalization Fund because that funding dried up and was not renewed. And so there's restaurants out there that may not have the same balance sheet as their neighbors, trying to figure out how to compete. And then as they were faced in the last year with increased food costs, as well as increased labor costs, they really thought about how are they passing on those increases and not hurting not hurting restaurant customers coming into their location or ordering their food. And what operators have told me is that it really is that question of value. So there are definitely most restaurants in a space where they have taken price increases, but they're always sensitive to how their customer is responding. And what they found is if they really think about the value of the food and the meal that they're providing, and does that value match the price point, they keep those customers coming back in a way that they're happy with the restaurant meal and with the price that they're paying. And so there is definitely a space where restaurant operators know they can't keep taking price increases because they'll wind up losing customers, but they have to figure out how they're going to make up the expense of those increased prices. You know, one thing I think people should be aware of is for the average independent restaurant, their margins are about 3 to 5%. So if you're looking at inflation that's well above that 5% number, if they're not increasing the prices that are on their menu, they're actually losing money just by operating and trying to cover all of their expenses. So there is that pain point where you need to increase some of the menu prices, but I'm proud to say through our numbers and the work of restaurant operators that we're getting some of that stabilization back in line. And so people are seeing much more consistency in food prices and therefore much more consistency in menu pricing.
Speaking of getting things back, what about getting people back? A lot of people had to get other jobs during the pandemic, had to leave their restaurant jobs. Has it been challenging to get them back or new people to replace people who had been very experienced?
Oh, very much so. You know, when people think about restaurants, they always think about the people working in the restaurants. You know, between the food and the service, that really is the restaurant experience. The restaurant industry employs 15 million people across the country. We're the second largest employer by sector. We're 10% of the nation's workforce. So the restaurant workforce is significant. And what we're hearing from restaurant operators is 2/3 of them say that right now they're understaffed. And they're in a space where we're up against 2 openings for every candidate in the US for positions right now. So restaurants are very much feeling the need of trying to make sure that they're creating attractive work environments for their team and making sure that they have what they need to serve their customers. So without a doubt, the restaurant industry is always thinking about how we can bring more people into the industry and make this an attractive place for people to work.
What about the role of AI? It's what I'm asking everybody today. I asked lawmakers about it. What about AI in the future of the restaurant industry?
I think AI in the restaurant industry is actually really fun. There's been some great conversations about AI. We just came off of the National Restaurant Association show in Chicago, where tens of thousands of people gathered and all of the latest technology was in place. And the hot topic of conversation, of course, was technology and AI. Some really interesting places where companies are using AI, mostly in test case at this point, is through the drive-through. So if you're thinking about quick service restaurants and going through the drive-through and you're interacting with an individual, restaurants are looking at bringing AI and large language models into that chatbot. And there's a great story about this of what Wendy's is doing at a test restaurant in Ohio, where they have a chatbot that is fully AI that will take your order as a drive-through customer and start processing, send that information into the kitchen and then start processing that order. And what's interesting about AI in the restaurant industry is the various ways that people order food. So if you think about Wendy's or any other quick service restaurant, there's probably lots of different names that people give, different than the corporate official brand name of a potential hamburger or sandwich that they offer. Some of their beverages, you hear biggie bags or different ways that they would upsell fries. And so those large language models have to be able to process the different ways that people will order in a way that they understand how to put that order through that has as much accuracy as possible. So when restaurants are thinking about where AI can come into place, keep using this example of the drive-through, it really is about how do we do this to improve the customer experience. And in a drive-through environment, that customer experience is all about speed, consistency, and accuracy. So that accuracy of the order is really critical, and that's where we're excited to see what AI brings into the space. We're also seeing a lot of people use AI as they look at hiring. We just talked about how it's so important for us to get workers into the restaurant industry. We'll actually need 500,000 more workers in the industry by the end of this year. And what we know is the speed of response to those applications is really critical. And AI can help get a real-time response and almost screening process for potential applicants through the services that restaurants are offering. And it's often, in a text format where you can be texting with AI that talks a little bit about your experience, talks about availability, and can go as far as setting up the interview or even discussing what a schedule might look like.
Today, as you know, there's a big debt limit bill headed to the House floor. It's likely going to pass, and then it heads to the Senate where there will be some drama, but it looks like it will pass. So that will avoid, potentially, if that happens, a global meltdown. But other than that issue, which everyone's got to be tracking, what issues, whether that's legislation or regulation, are you tracking out of Washington?
Well, other than the debt ceiling, which definitely we are among the group that wants to make sure that that is taken care of, the big things that we're concerned about go back into the question of workers. And we're really pleased with legislation that was introduced by Representatives Smucker and Cuellar for the essential workers for economic advancement. And this would allow a 3-year visa for non-immigrant workers. So not a citizenship question, not, kind of dealing with some of the larger immigration issues, but really providing that visa for people that want to work in the U.S. In a documented and legal way. This program has a capacity of 65,000 workers. So when we think about the work that's needed in the industry, it's really a drop in the bucket, but a wonderful start for having a space for non-skilled workers to come in. We're also very concerned about what's happening in the credit card fee space. Credit card swipe fees for restaurants are the third highest expense in a restaurant, behind food costs and labor costs. And what we're advocating for is to find more competition in the marketplace. We would like to see for any of the networks that there are unaffiliated networks that are required to join or allowed to join into a transaction so that consumers or the businesses actually have a choice in providers. And that choice in providers allows for more competition, which would create some more pricing pressure to try to keep some of those fees down.
That swipe fee fight is quite intense. It's been going on for quite some time and probably be going on for quite some time. Michelle Korsmo, President and CEO of the National Restaurant Association. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Bob.
This summer could be one for the travel record books, especially with packed airports. And here to talk about the airline industry is Scott Kirby, the CEO of United Airlines. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Well, I first want to talk to you now that we're 3+ years after the pandemic. We're coming out of it. It was a very strange time, obviously challenging time for so many people in industries, including the airlines. What were some of the lessons learned and reflections about it?
Well, I guess one of the lessons would be you can get through almost anything if a team pulls together and works together. If we'd have known the scope of the crisis on day one, I don't think anyone would have thought airlines could have made it through. And here we are, carrying a record number of customers on the other side. Another lesson for me is actually that in a time of uncertainty, it's important to be decisive. I think there was a Teddy Roosevelt quote that said, in a crisis, the best thing to do is make the right decision. The second best thing is to make the wrong decision. The worst thing to do is make no decision. And I think that was pretty true during the crisis.
Well, Well, right now we have a tight labor market. Unemployment rate is very low, but United is planning to hire 15,000 people this year. Can you tell us about your plans and why you're going to be hiring so many people?
Well, United is growing faster than any airline in history anywhere in the world has done in terms of absolute growth. So we did hire over 15,000 last year. We intend to hire over 15,000 again this year. And at United, we're able to actually hire, we have a couple of 100,000 people that have applied for flight attendant jobs because they're great careers. They're really not jobs. They're careers where you can stay for a career, make good wages, support a family, have good benefits. We're able to hire. The challenges for us are more in all the infrastructure that supports aviation, whether it's fuel vendors or TSA or air traffic controllers. All the support infrastructure around aviation is far more challenging for us than actually hiring at United. But we are glad to be hiring at such a rapid pace here at United.
Scott, what are your views on the economy? Obviously inflation is still high. It has come down a little bit. There's a lot of concern. Basically, 4 in 5 people think we are either in a recession or we're going to be heading into one. What's your outlook?
So, I think it's a tale of two economies. And the business investment or selling to businesses portion of the economy is in a recession. And you can see that in the kinds of businesses and how they're reacting. We see in our own data that our business travel is probably 20 to 25% below where we would expect it to be right now. But the flip side of that is that the consumer portion of the economy is very strong, particularly the services side. So I think a lot of what is happening here is we had an economy that over-indexed to hard goods during the pandemic because you couldn't travel, you couldn't go to restaurants, and now it's just rebalancing back to normal. And so if you're selling, hard goods, if you're in the home repair, business, then it feels like a recession. It is a recession because you over-index for a couple of years. And if you're an airline, if you're a cruise company, a hotel, a restaurant, a salon, any of those things, it feels pretty good right now because you're coming back out of the recession. And so I think it's a tale of two economies: business recession, but strong, particularly for services, consumer side of the economy at the same time.
As far as just going back to COVID, are there any issues that are still outstanding, whether that's supply chain issues or United States is doing pretty well on COVID compared to other countries, but obviously you're in a global industry. Are there any outstanding issues that you're like, yeah, we still got a problem here?
Well, I think we've moved into the endemic phase from the pandemic phase of COVID. And so, for example, we have higher sick calls than we had pre-pandemic because there's a new, endemic illness called COVID that people still get. And so we have that. And the supply chain, those kinds of issues are still recovering. You look at, I think, air traffic control, not typically called supply chain, but, they stopped hiring for a few years. There's a limited number of people that they can hire and train at their single facility in Oklahoma. And then the Transportation Secretary says they're 3,000 controllers short. That's a really big hole to dig out of. When they can train something like 1,500 a year, and they've got something like 1,200 retirements a year. And so getting behind, that's a perfect example of once you get behind, it takes a very long time to dig out of that unless you do something different.
What about changes in the airline industry kind of moving forward with technological advances? Obviously, everyone's talking about AI now. Where is the industry headed in the next 5 to 20 years?
Yeah, well, the aircraft technology, continues to evolve, but the revolutionary portions of aircraft technology are likely going to be supersonic aircraft, which United Airlines was the first airline here in the U.S. to put in an order for supersonic aircraft, the boom supersonic, and then electric aircraft, and what we're doing around sustainable aviation fuel. So there's a lot of work that's happening in those areas. There's also an awful lot of continued progress in improving the customer experience. And I think this is one of the places that generative AI is going to be helpful, and particularly at communicating to customers and hopefully coming up with better answers for us as well. When there's air traffic control delays or there's weather, how can we use generative AI to come up with better solutions that minimize the number of customers impacted from those kinds of events. But in particular, to do a more effective job of communicating what is complex but communicating it in more simple terms to customers. And there's a lot of other use cases, but that's one that I'm particularly excited about.
In Washington, as you know, policymakers are grappling with the environment and climate change, and there's a lot of proposals out there. We saw some proposals get enacted in the Inflation Reduction Act. As far as what United is doing on climate change and the environment, can you touch upon that?
Sure. United is the leading global airline around the world in taking real action around climate change. And two big things. One, sustainable aviation fuel. I talked about electric aircraft earlier, but big airplanes flying long distance, there's not even a theoretical battery technology that could power them. They're just too heavy. So we're going to use fuel, but sourcing it from a sustainable source instead of sourcing it from oil is really important in the future. And, we're the leader around the globe. We started an investment fund to invest in the kind of startups that are really building that industry. And then the second important point is we've made a commitment to be 100% green by 2050 at United, which is distinct from others' net zero. And what makes it distinct is we're going to get there without using traditional carbon offsets. And if you want, I can give you a longer speech on traditional carbon offsets, but the short answer is they're mostly not real. They're borderline fraudulent. And even when they are real, they're so small that they can never scale up to make a meaningful difference. And when every company is using that as their way to get to net zero, we're not going to come even close.
I want to go back to kind of the economy, and I know you touched upon this, but I was actually flying United to Savannah this past weekend, and I tell you, the airport was packed, but that also depends on not only supply and demand, but prices. Where do you think prices for airline travel are going this year?
Well, thanks for flying us. I hope it was a good flight.
Yeah, was that?
Prices are coming back to kind of the levels that they were pre-pandemic. So, in real terms, they're still lower than they were a decade ago, but they had an artificial low during the pandemic that come back to kind of what I would call normal. So my guess is pricing will grow kind of with inflation as we move forward.
Are you concerned, now in Washington we have this raging debt limit fight? Look, there is a bill that's going to move forward, it looks like, but until it's past the finish line, there are a lot of industries are concerned because economists have said if we don't raise the debt ceiling, it could really damage the global economy and could lead to millions of jobs being lost. Are you confident that the Congress can actually get something done here?
Well, a week ago, I was a lot more worried about it, and actually said on TV that we should avoid an unforced error. We're doing a pretty good job of managing the economy either into a soft landing or a mild recession, but defaulting on the debt would be an unforced error that could have really significant consequences. So I'm really encouraged by what happened over the weekend. On both sides, compromise where neither one got everything they want. That's the nature of what the political system would be. And I'd make an even bigger point about it. The fact that they were able to find a compromise. I'm a hopeless optimist, I suppose, but makes me think that perhaps they can use that template to find other places where they can compromise instead of just being opposed to everything that the other side is for.
What do you think that Washington policymakers should know? I know United obviously has people in Washington tracking legislation and regulations and trade association as well. But what is something that you think that policymakers should know, outside the Beltway, maybe frustration with regulators or legislation or anything else like that?
I mean, that's pretty broad. I'd like our government to function more effectively and focus on what's the right thing for the country instead of what's the right thing for politics. There's too much focus on, what does this mean for my parties or my personal election chances, as opposed to what's the right thing for the country. And on a more tactical basis, really important for the aviation industry and for the basic infrastructure for the country to get an FAA reauthorization bill done. We have, in real dollars, the FAA's budget is smaller than it was 20 years ago, and they've been asked to take responsibility for all kinds of new things: space, drones, far more resources dedicated to aircraft certification programs. And they've had to fund that by taking it out of the front line. And there's 3,000 fewer controllers, over 3,000 controllers short. We have fewer air traffic controllers today than we had 30 years ago. And that's not just an issue for airlines. That's not just an issue for our customers. that's also an issue for the economy. I mean, it's a huge contributor to the economy, and we need to get that done and fixed.
You mentioned the FAA reauthorization bill. Reauthorization legislation usually is bipartisan, but sometimes there can be some snags. Are you confident that Congress can work on a bipartisan basis to get it done?
Well, I'm hopeful. And across the board, when I'm up on Capitol Hill, this is one bill that people want to be bipartisan, has a history of being bipartisan, and that people want to be bipartisan. So my fingers are crossed. On most issues, everyone seems to be aligned, and we'll see how it goes. I'm headed there tomorrow.
When you're in contact with policymakers, whether it's the Department of Transportation, I mean, has there been a good communication from this administration? Because obviously there's always going to be airline difficulties, whether that's weather-related or otherwise.
You know, this is one where I think we're pretty aligned on trying to, get the appropriate amount of resources for the FAA. Secretary Buttigieg talked about being 3,000 controllers short a week or two ago. The Air Traffic Controllers Union talks about being short. Every single airline talks about it. We see it every single day, day in and day out, the impact of air traffic control shortages. So, it's hard for anyone to be credible and not be aligned with, we need more resources for air traffic control.
Is it, when you're working with other airlines, obviously they're rivals, but you all want a lot of the same things. Is it easy to kind of put, or is it difficult to put your differences aside to say, okay, we need to unite to ask for X, Y, and Z from Washington?
Most of the time we're pretty good on it on things that are an industry level. Sometimes there are airlines that can't avoid the temptation to try to do something for themselves. There's one issue that's come up in this one that I hope we can put aside that would be incredibly contentious if it stays on the table. But hopefully we'll be able to put that one aside and focus on what's good for the country, for the infrastructure of the country, and the whole aviation system overall.
I got a last question, but it's a bit broad. So two-parter. Number one, what is the toughest part of your job day to day? And number two, what's the most rewarding part of your job?
Well, I have a great job. So it's fun. I can't imagine having a better job. We have great people here at United. I used to say that we're going to build the biggest and the best airline in the history of aviation. We've now become the largest. We're growing. We're viewed as a leader around the globe in sustainability. We're leading with things like the Aviate Academy, of creating opportunity for everyone. People are feeling really good. And so, the best thing for me is probably getting on airplanes or walking through terminals or even walking down the street and an employee or a customer stops me to tell me that, how proud they are of United. And I say that I have the easiest job of anyone at United Airlines because I only have one responsibility, which is to create an airline that our employees are proud of, and they'll take care of everything else. And so when I hear that, and I hear it a lot, I heard it on my flight today from both the pilots and the flight attendants, it makes me feel really good.
I'm sure you keep them on their toes when they know you're on the plane. but that's a very
I think they behave normally with me.
Well, Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My next guest is Evan Smith, a co-founder and the CEO of Altana, which uses AI to help governments and the private sector build safe, resilient, and sustainable supply chains. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Evan, I briefly described your company, but can you give us a little background of, number one, the company and also its role in the world supply chain?
Sure. We're a New York City-based startup. We're almost 5 years into this. And we are building a shared source of truth for the global supply chain. So we connect governments, enterprises, logistics service providers, and even financial service providers into a common operating picture that shows all the companies and product flows and sort of physical movements of goods all around the world. And what we do to build that picture of the world is we connect both public and non-public data through federated machine learning. So imagine a hub and spoke federated architecture where all the world's public and non-public data are being crunched by our platform. And we produce this sort of rendered, derived picture of what is roughly half the world's physical economy today in near real time.
You mentioned it's been 5 years, so let's talk about the pandemic. How did that change everything?
It accelerated some things we expected to be true, in the sense that we built the company and founded the company on the thesis that the globalization of the last 75 years was going to fall apart. So whether it's COVID or some of the geopolitical dislocation that's happening today, the kind of founding perspective that we had was that supply chains were going to break, and it was going to be very important to kind of know who was in your extended supply chain network and begin to manage supply chains, not as buyer-supplier relationships alone, but as the entire sort of extended network of production. So that's been absolutely accelerating our business. And I think one of the things we were surprised by with COVID was we saw supply chains go from sort of an operational consideration to more of a strategic board level, C-suite level consideration. And so the buyer in our world has changed pretty dramatically.
But in what ways, if you can expound upon that?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. So CEOs, COOs, CFOs are now focused on supply chains, not just in the sense of getting goods somewhere on time or being able to receive goods you've purchased on time, but even as a license to operate. So there's intense sort of geopolitical and compliance and even intellectual property risks that are embedded in supply chains that are all coming to the fore today. So if you are selling electronics overseas, suddenly all these commerce restrictions on Russian sanctions, they turn into really like a fundamental license to operate. If you're importing apparel into the United States, suddenly the ban on forced labor products could impact hundreds of millions of dollars, or even billions of dollars of procurement you've already committed to. So supply chain is sort of moving away from the back office, make sure things arrive on time kind of mindset to really like this is our license to do business in the world.
Mm-hmm. And what's your advice? Now we're obviously coming out of the pandemic, but potential obstacles and problems don't go away, right?
They don't. I think if anything, it's getting worse, not better. So, again, it's not just about moving a package from point A to point B and whether it gets stuck at the port. I mean, that's sort of yesterday's problem. If you look at the confluence of geopolitical competition, the big set of regulations coming in Europe and the US and UK on labor rights, on ESG in the supply chain, all the investor demands around sustainability. And if you look at some of the sort of climate-related disasters that are sort of breaking things in one part of the world and causing ripple effects in another part of the world, I think all these things point to a current state and a future state that's more volatile, more dislocated. And so, again, you need to begin managing these supply chains as networks. You have to engage much more proactively with your extended supplier base. You have to engage proactively with your regulators as you move things across borders. So this is going to move from, again, a sort of back office function of moving boxes around the world to really a C-suite level strategic kind of function.
Evan, what's your take on, you mentioned regulations in ESG, and obviously there are certain things and many things that have to be regulated, but where's the fine line of effective regulation, but also not harming the economy?
Well, we're sort of living through an experiment in real time as it relates to Russia's war in Ukraine, right? So you see a coordinated effort to sanction Russian entities to prevent the flows of goods into Russia on the one hand, or to prevent the flows out of Russia on the other hand. And the West, I think, has gone through a lot of tension in wanting to balance the economic imperatives and especially in a very fragile moment of Western economies, with the real desire to sort of counteract the invasion. So I think looking back over the last 18 months, what you've seen is when it came down to it, the government acted, has mostly relied on the private sector to catch up. It's kind of been fascinating to see natural gas supplies rebound into Europe and sort of make up for the lost pipeline inputs from Russia. So that's one example of many where I think governments here are on a course to regulate, to put up barriers, and the private sector is being expected to keep up. I don't know that that's sort of the right choice in every case, but I think that's the choice that's being made generally.
In Washington, D.C., Congress obviously reacted to the pandemic by passing a slew of legislation. Some of it was bipartisan. Some of it wasn't. Some of it dealt with supply chains with the CHIPS legislation that got signed into law. Yep. What's been the effect of that?
Well, I think I would put the IRA and CHIPS into the same bucket of explicit industrial policy, right? Where we've moved as a nation from sort of a free trade, neoliberal, neoconservative mindset to one of economic competition in the world and a recognition that supply chains are the theater for much of this geopolitical and economic competition that's taking place. So in the CHIPS Act and in the IRA, what you've seen is both sort of positive interventions with the availability of money and very negative interventions to curtail, the flows of technology or money or investment or the movement of goods. And I think that's a portend of things to come. I think that's going to be sort of rising as a policy tool, not diminishing.
Every industry now is talking about the future of AI and how it affects their industries. What is the future of AI in this space?
Well, we are working to build that. So in supply chains, you've got a disconnected, siloed, but extremely data-rich global picture. The opportunity is to connect that data, to learn from that data, and to bring visibility and decision-making into an AI-enabled framework. That has operational benefits, it has compliance benefits, it can have ESG benefits, it can have risk management, security benefits, but you have to get the data. So I think what's happening at this stage in the game is with large language models able to operate on vast quantities of text data, and with things like federated learning, which is what our company is pioneering in the supply chain space, you can not only connect previously, siloed, orphaned, disconnected data with federation, but you can start to build a shared source of truth across all of that siloed data and do things that were previously completely impossible. So show me where the raw materials for this pair of jeans coming into the country actually comes from. Ask a question of a machine, what happens to my business if China invades Taiwan? And have that answer contextualized in terms of your product families, the revenue associated with each product, the multi-tier value chains associated with each of those products, and the understanding of the question of, what happens in this geopolitical scenario. So in short, AI is on the verge of changing everything. This is a text data domain. The big breakthroughs in the last year have been around text data, large language models. And, the pace is picking up on an accelerating basis.
You look at a lot of data, as you've talked about, both public and private. What are your views kind of on the economy in the United States and globally? Are you able to see anything in this vast wealth of data that shows some signs?
In terms of a kind of macroeconomic outlook?
Exactly.
In the U.S. or otherwise?
Yep.
I think what we can say is that the conditions that impacted the supply side of the macroeconomic equation. So the supply chain constraints, the logistics bottlenecks, the manufacturing capacity limits. Those things generally aren't going to get better anytime soon. The demand side of the equation with all the money printing and stimulation, I won't speak to, but on the supply side, I think we're going to be living through years, if not decades, of regionalization of supply chains, of fracturing of what would otherwise be like just-in-time, highly efficient supply chains as the world dislocates. And if anything, we've seen that in the data that we process. A lot of nearshoring or regionalization, the cessation of typical supply chain links, in particular out of China into other parts of the world. So those supply side parts of the macroeconomic equation are not getting more efficient or cheaper anytime soon. So that all points to me toward an era of more sustained inflation, higher interest rates, and everything that comes from that.
Mm-hmm. Last question. Your company has grown significantly. What's the future of the next 1 to 5 years for Altana?
In the next 1 to 2 years, it's just executing like crazy and leaning heavily into this AI moment. We've built a really globally unique data network and data asset, and the kinds of questions our customers are looking to solve are, strategic decision-making, task automation, and those are the kinds of things that lend themselves very well to AI. So that's one. In 5 years, I would see us as public. So we're looking to build the Google Maps of supply chain. We want to be the shared source of truth for the world's, licit economy to come into a common operating picture on the supply chain. So that means powering other applications, powering other services, and building an enduring business. And in our world, that means you've got to go public.
Well, that's a big and bold plan. We've run out of time. Evan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to all of our guests and to all of you for watching. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we'll have the video up from the event on our website, thehill.com, shortly. I'm Bob Cusack. I hope you have a great rest of your day.